Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. This week I have the Voidscarred Kill Team box on my desk. I'd like to use contrast paints and highlights to achieve a finished look similar to the box art. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I primed it gray, followed by a heavy layer of white paint with my airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, I would recommend undercoating your model with gray cere or white spray paint instead. I'd like to base coat the armor with a dark turquoise. Akhelian green contrast paint is close to what I want, but it's a little too transparent, and it will make too much surface variety. I decided to add some Stegadon scale green, which is an opaque base paint. By mixing the two paints together, we can get the working properties of both. It will make a color that flows into the recesses and creates some natural shading, like a contrast paint does. But it will also have a smoother, more solid finish similar to a base paint. I mixed 1 part Stegadon scale green and 2 parts Akhelian green, and painted all the armor with it. Apply this just like any other contrast style paint. Work on one section at a time, and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed. I'm not worried about being too neat on the armor. And if some paint splashes on the other areas, that's okay, since we'll be using opaque paints to base coat the rest of the model. The armor on the box art has a second shade of turquoise, almost black, and we can get that color by painting a layer of black Templar. I want some of the turquoise to show through this layer, and I don't want it to get too dark. So rather than flooding the model with paint like I usually do, I'm applying less paint and in a much more controlled manner. We'll leave the armor for now and move on to base coating the other areas. You could paint these in any order you like. Each model is different, and I try to paint the areas that are hardest to reach first. In this case, it's the inside of the cape, which I'm painting with Zandri dust. It's a little tricky to access it, and you may find it easier to paint the model in sub-assembly instead. Next I painted the loincloth with Khorne red. There's a tight spot in here where the belts overlap the cloth, and this is a perfect example of why I want to paint the red first, before painting the leather belt. If I painted the leather first, it would be really difficult to paint the cloth afterwards. So right now I can paint the red, and it's okay if I'm a little sloppy with it, because it'll be much easier to paint the leather on top. After the red dried, I shaded it with a layer of Nuln oil. Before base coating the leather, I thinned some black paint with a small amount of water and painted a narrow black line around the leather details. I think it's easier to paint the black line now rather than later. Next I painted the leather with XV88, making sure to avoid the black outline that I just painted. There are some metal details on the belts, and I'm going to ignore those for now. I'll paint those with opaque paints after shading the leather. After this layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. With the base coat dry, next I shaded the leather with Skeleton Horde. You don't have to use contrast paints over a white base coat only. They also work really well as shades. After shading the leather, I shaded the inside of the cloak, and rather than paint it all over, I painted the shade directly into the deeper folds. After painting an area, I rinsed the brush, wiped it on a paper towel, and then I used the clean brush to blend out the edge. I'd like the leather to be just a little bit darker in the deepest recesses, so I shaded it with a layer of Nuln oil. I used the brush to direct more of the shade into the recesses and less on the raised edges. Next I painted the details on the belt with black paint, as well as the gap in the weapon holster. Then I painted the belt details with Iron Hand steel, leaving a thin outline of black around each. Painting those areas black first takes a little more time, but I think it adds some much needed definition for such small areas. Then I shaded the steel with Gryph-Charger Gray. Sometimes I like to paint black with a dark gray base coat first, and then shade the rest of the way. I painted parts of the guns and the back of the cape with gray number 2 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Eshin Gray is a close match. With the dark gray base coat dry, I shaded those areas with Nuln Oil. I've found the new formula of Nuln Oil isn't quite as strong as the older version, so after the first layer dries, you'll want to paint a second layer to darken the color. Or alternatively, you can make the Nuln Oil stronger by mixing in a touch of Black Templar, which is what I did here. I mixed about 6 parts Nuln Oil to 1 part Black Templar. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. Next I base coated the rest of the guns with Bonewhite. I'd like this color to be solid and bright, so I painted a second layer after the first one dried. I'd like to shade the Bonewhite without it getting too dark. Skeleton Horde is the right color, but it's too strong on its own, so I diluted it with about 3 parts contrast medium. The shade got a little too dark in some areas, so I went back and touched it up with a glaze of Bonewhite. Finally, I painted the symbols on the shoulder pad and the helmet with Retributor armor. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to add some highlights, so let's keep going. I'm going to highlight the armor first with Ahriman blue, and I'll paint it in 2 stages. I began by painting a glaze on the lighter sections of the armor. Thin the paint with some water, and with barely any paint on the brush, paint the glaze over the armor. There should be very little paint on the brush, and it should dry almost as soon as you put it on the model. Look for any areas where the contrast base coat dried unevenly, and build up a few layers until the armor looks smooth and even. Next I took some undiluted paint and I highlighted the edges of the blackened armor sections. For the next highlight, I mixed equal parts Ahriman blue and Baharroth blue, and I picked out the edges of all the blue armor. I skipped over the black armor for this step. A good rule of thumb for the first highlight is to take the thinnest line you can make and double it. I like to make the first highlight a little wider than that. I think it makes the model stand out from further away. But that's personal preference, and you can paint your highlights as wide or as narrow as you like. Next I highlighted all the edges with Baharroth blue, beginning with the blue armor. I focused the highlights on the sharpest corners and the upward facing edges. Then I highlighted the black armor. Baharroth blue is a big step up in value, so I'm trying to make these highlights as narrow as possible. Next I highlighted the red cloth, beginning with an edge highlight of Mephiston red. Followed by a sharp edge highlight of Wild Rider red. Moving on to the leather next, first I painted a subtle glaze highlight with XV88. Depending on how light your shades were, you may not need this layer. My shades got a little dark on some areas of the leather, and I wanted to glaze back the base coat so the next highlights aren't too stark. For the next highlight, I painted the edges of the leather with Balor brown. I decided to add one more small highlight, and I mixed some white into the Balor brown. You can paint as much or as little of this highlight as you like. Let's highlight the black next with gray number 2, and we'll start with the cloak. I painted some sharp edge highlights running along the top of each fold. You could blend these out if you like with some glazes, but I think I'll keep my highlights sharp instead. Depending on how dark your shade got on the weapons, you may be able to skip this highlight. I ended up needing to highlight a few areas of the guns, but not too much. Next I highlighted all the black areas one more time with gray number 4 from my custom gray scale. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone is a close match. I made these highlights very sharp and narrow, and I focused them on the most prominent edges and corners. Next I highlighted the Bonewhite portions of the guns with Offwhite. I highlighted the edges of the metal areas with Stormhost silver. The gold symbols don't have a lot of depth, so I don't think they needed a shade, but I'll give them a couple highlights with the silver. The last things to paint are the eyes and the gemstones, and I began by painting them black. For the blue gems and the eyes, I base coated with Baharroth blue, making sure to leave a thin black outline. After the base coat dried, I painted a thin layer of Akhelian green contrast paint. The paint will pool wherever the brush last touches the model, so I like to end the brush stroke near the top of the gems. That way it creates a natural blend. After that first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. Next I highlighted the bottom portions of the gem and eyes with a mix of equal parts Baharroth blue and white. And finally I painted a small dot of white in the top corner. I began the green gems with a base coat of toxic yellow, leaving a thin black outline around the gem. Next I painted the gem with Warp Lightning contrast paint, in the same manner as the blue gems. Finish the brush stroke near the top of the gem to create a natural blend, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. And finally I painted a dot of white in the top corner. I assembled the model with superglue, and then used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue to the base. Before the glue dried, I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted over the sand with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide. I dry brushed the base with a heavy coat of Mournfang brown, followed by Balor brown, and then Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln oil. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang brown, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I always enjoy painting Aeldari. Lots of bright colors, and I think painting an army is a lot more manageable since each unit is a little different. It keeps things from getting too monotonous. What do you think? Do you like each unit or squad having some individuality? Or do you prefer all your models to have the same color scheme? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.